Welcome to Hacking Hypermobility Podcast.
I'm Luna.
And I'm Shelly.
And we're two bendy mamas.
Hacking Hypermobility.
Thanks for coming back to episode 2 of Hacking Hypermobility. Shelly and I are so glad you're here. We hope you learned something from this episode too. How are you today, Shelly?
I'm actually feeling pretty good. You can see my black eye is gone. And today we're going to talk about what you need to do to prepare and get ready for the doctor to be evaluated for hypermobility and EDS in general. Because unfortunately, so many patients are missed or diagnosed later in life, and it leads to just a bunch of unsupported symptoms well into adulthood.
So, unfortunately, as we know.
Yeah.
In case y'all didn't check it out, we have a special guest today. If you're on video, Shelly has her giant zebra squishmallow. It's bigger than her.
It is now, since I can't eat anything. Thanks, buddy.
If you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, you would prefer to have captions, we do put this on YouTube. Shelly did an amazing job editing our first episode so that we had some accessibility options. So thanks, Shell.
You're welcome. I tried.
So should we do a review first before we go forward?
I think we should do a quick little review. So let's get into that.
So we talk about the Ehlers-Danlos Syndromes and hypermobility and the inherited connective tissue disorders just kind of in general. But I did want to mention that there really genuinely are more rare subtypes of the Ehlers-Danlos Syndromes, and there are other types of connective tissue disorders. Some of them are more rare even than some others. There is a wide variety of inherited connective tissue disorders, but an overarching connection is the warning sign of hypermobility in your joints. Late diagnosis is unfortunately typical for the most common variant of EDS, which we spend a lot of time discussing, called the hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or HEDS. And then next episode, we need to go into further detail about the diagnostic process specifically for hypermobile EDS. But I did want to mention that both diagnoses, known as hypermobility syndrome and hypermobility type of EDS or HEDS, can be just as devastating as the other types. There's actually building evidence that the hypermobility disorders, just in general, are debilitating multisystemic syndromes, not just musculoskeletal joint issues, as many physicians learned or been taught when they were in school. There's also a shift in thinking about hypermobility disorders to really be more of a spectrum of medical conditions. And then another shift in understanding is that HEDS and HSC are just not as rare as the medical statistics currently available shows. Instead, they're just less diagnosed. So as we discuss these things further, I wanted to mention that the information that we share is referenced for you to come back to in our show notes for you and on the blog on our website, hackinghypermobility.com. Yeah. We also share a lot from our own personal experience, so a little bit different than yours. So we try to combine that with what we call evidence-based resources, so including medical research, the medical studies, the medical articles, the books, that sort of things that have been published by these smart people studying these disorders. So we'll include certain highlights in the show notes like we've done before, but we also have like a large list of resources for you. We put it on the website in the blog if you're interested in nerdy things like particular medical publication citations, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and we also have some helpful books and websites that are geared more towards the patient, like a general patient who doesn't have that in-depth hyper focus into all of the nerdy stuff like we do. And so this isn't an inclusive list, but we're going to share some ways on how you can get some more information and support. The primary resource that we have been mentioning so far are the Ehlers-Danlos Society, which is ehlers-danlos.com, and then there's Ehlers-Danlos Support UK, and that's the one that's .org, right? The primary resource as a patient is to start there. And
I'll mention 2 books that we're going to reference just in this episode, but there are some others. There's even some books written for kids too, by the way. First one is called
Disjointed: Navigating the Diagnosis and Management of Hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome and Hypermobility Spectrum Disorders
by Anne Maitland, and Understanding Hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome and Hypermobility Spectrum Disorder by Claire Smith, who also has a really helpful website called Understanding Hypermobile, the same as the book.
okay,
I'm not going to say it all over again. And then
you're not
right now,
so easy to say.
yeah. And right now, Shelley and I are reading a newly published book by a fellow zebra named Christy Calm to do an upcoming book review.
Yeah.
So there are lots of books out there. We've both read a good deal, so we'll reference some of those as we go forward. Smith's book and website is very helpful. It kind of is a nice summary, and her book is actually kind of written with different perspectives. So there's a perspective for physicians and there's a perspective for patients, which is really helpful.
Yeah, that is helpful.
Yeah.
I need to practice sounding more like a patient, because I go in and I'm like, blah, 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 and then the doctor's like, I'm not talking to you. Mm-mm.
Me too.
Sorry, I interrupted. Sorry.
So Smith's book has a nice little summary. This is our review. I'm going to just read this summary to you in case you're catching up. So hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is now considered the most prevalent type of heritable disorder of connective tissue in the world. And the prevalence for association of generalized joint hypermobility and widespread pain is higher still. You actually find parts of her book for free available to download on the EDS UK website, which is nice to have, by the way.
Yeah. And did you know that EDS is like a hot topic right now. And
Hey, I screwed up the intro. I'm going to talk about this book now. Here's a picture of it.
One of the key statements that came out of that book, it says, EDS is a genetic disorder affecting collagen formation and function. It affects virtually every organ system, which can result in significant morbidity and mortality. Complications of this disease include arterial rupture, organ rupture, joint dislocation, chronic pain, and fatigue, and many others.
Long list. And then a recent article from the Journal of American Board of Family Medicine by Dr. Atwell last year says, the patient with hypermobility spectrum disorder, HSD, will often have a range of complaints involving multiple organ systems. Many of these included in the validated questionnaire for hypermobility. In other words, diagnostic criteria. These are often the symptoms that draw the attention of patients and cause them to seek care. These complaints may include manifestations of autonomic dysfunction and other cardiovascular concerns, a wide range of gastrointestinal issues, anxiety, phobic disorders, major depression, headache, and chronic fatigue, among others. When evaluating a patient with such a wide array of complaints, one may wish to focus on the individual concerns that may seem more serious in nature to the provider than those that are most bothersome to the patient. Ironic, I'm battling a migraine right now.
That was me last time.
Yeah. Every time there's something.
Yeah, there's probably gonna be.
Case in point, every one of us has something going on at most points in the day, and so we're seeking care for the things that are bothering us at the moment. So it may not be your thumb.
Yeah.
It may be, your headache. It may be your awful periods.
Okay. I've heard so far, just in this episode, like HSD, EDS, HEDS, JHS, XYZ, LMNOP. What is, am I back working for the government again? Like what are all these acronyms? Are they all the same? What do they mean? I mean, I know sort of what some of them mean, but you mentioned one I hadn't heard of. So enlighten me, please.
It makes it feel a little inaccessible, the letters.
Yeah.
So don't let all the changing terminology confuse you. So the hypermobility spectrum disorders, HSDs, encompass a large array of connective tissue disorders characterized by joint instability and chronic pain.
Okay.
So there's different types.
Does instability also mean laxity? Because help me understand.
Yeah, sort of.
Okay.
Yeah, sort of. And medically, they're kind of two different things. But what's interesting is the words that we use to describe these conditions keep changing. One, because our understanding keeps changing, but also two, as our understanding changes, we try to better identify these disorders. So the medical community has reclassified the Ehlers-Danlos Syndromes a couple of times, most recently in 1997 and then in 2017.
Okay.
The new criteria for hypermobile EDS changed quite dramatically in 2017. It's much more strict than the previous criteria, and it was done to better define the disease subtypes. But so those criteria are already being reviewed. By 2020, the scientists and doctors involved in connective tissue disorders and research had already started to shift in that approach.
To the more like tighter.
No, to criticizing the
Oh,
type.
okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it seems like if you would be excluding a lot of people who might benefit from an
right.
actual
And
evaluation.
ultimately, like that exclusion just comes down to like semantics, because it doesn't really matter in some ways what your diagnosis is, because some of us may have the exact same thing and have a different diagnosis because of the time frame in which you got diagnosed.
Well, that's true.
So that's some of the criteria.
Okay.
Confusion.
Well, okay.
So the Norse lab is at USC here in the States. And they've been studying the candidate HEDS gene, and they published an article in 2020 saying it's now just accepted that benign familial articular hypermobility syndrome and joint hypermobility syndrome are identical to HEDS and no longer thought to represent unique conditions. So there have been lots of terms. We didn't even go over all of them. I'm just going to list some synonyms.
Yeah, well, okay. Yeah.
So benign joint hypermobility syndrome.
All right.
It's not very benign. Spoiler alert. EDS, hypermobility type. EDS, type 3. Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, hypermobility type.
Didn't we just say that? Oh, no, that's what it's
Ehlers-Danlos
spelled
syndrome,
out. Oh, my God.
type 3. HEDS, joint hypermobility syndrome. The idea is that we have all these terms, it's confusing patients, and really it's just a spectrum, and maybe they're kind of all the same thing.
Okay, so that was my auto cat feeder, if people heard that in the background.
Life hacks.
Wait, okay, so all of this has clearly resulted in confusion, but that probably just adds to the lack of understanding, right? And then, like you were saying, now they're reviewing and saying we made it too strict, so that sounds like some controversy. What about, like, I actually had to ask my doctor this when I had some exams done. They put diagnostic codes, but they were like 2 different codes and they looked weird, and I could tell they weren't like the same structure. So clearly it's 2 different things. So what is that? And what do the people do who do not meet the criteria for HEDS if they're are they did they lose their diagnosis? Like, how do you, it's so important. Like,
yeah, that's a good conversation. That's part of the discussion that's come about from that last round of changes. And honestly, the codes that are in the medical systems in the United States, they come from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, the CMS program.
Okay.
It's called an ICD-10 code, and it's a big software package that goes into the electronic health system, programs.
So that's like when you get like a lab order and all those numbers, or you get a job in medical transcription. That's what it is?
Yeah.
I've always wondered what that was.
I could tell you all about that, but I'm not going to. But interestingly, those aren't updated all the time.
Oh, is it like a DSM situation, like where they take all this time?
Exactly.
Well, so no wonder stuff's outdated because of the review time.
So my chart has like 3 different things depending on which doctor put it in, because they can't put my exact diagnosis code doesn't even, like, it doesn't have a code.
Well, the other day at the neurologist, he said to me, well, since you have fibromyalgia, and I was like, I have fibromyalgia? Like, I was
He
like,
told
I've
me
been,
that.
I was like, when did I get first heard for me? And
Mhm.
he's like, well, yeah, with all of your like muscular myofascial, blah, 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 blah. He's like, of course it is that. And I was like, oh, well, that's news to me. Cool.
Of
All right.
course.
Yeah. So,
There's controversy in the term of fibromyalgia too. Anyhow. But identifying which type of hypermobility disorder, inherited disorder you have is still in guiding appropriate care health risk, because you really do need to be seen by a provider that can distinguish the different types. So no
right.
matter the designation, a hypermobile human has likely been seeking medical care for all sorts of complaints and problems and has been struggling to find answers for a
Yeah.
while. If you found our podcast, I'm assuming that you've become aware that being bendy might be behind some of your other struggles, right?
Yeah. So I feel like, I don't know if anyone else has experienced this. When I found out I was pregnant, all of a sudden I saw pregnant people everywhere. Right.
Right.
So I got
Wait, what's that
diagnosed.
called? That has a term.
It does have a phenomenon, and I can't remember what it's called, but I'll tack it in here when I Google it later.
Hey, I looked it up. It's called the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, or the frequency illusion. Cool.
But so I got diagnosed with HEDS by Johns Hopkins last year. Hasn't even been a year, right? I am now running into so many zebras. So, like, is this really rare? Like, is it really rare? I feel like everybody I meet now has it. So what's up?
Right? So the actual prevalence has kind of been studied
Okay.
with statistics. But again, those statistics are only as good as
Junk in, junk out.
the data. Exactly. So the data that they're pulling are from electronic health records. And again, we just talked about that coding may not be entirely reflective of the exact situation.
I'd like to see the data crosswalk for that with them trying to like run and pull all of it. Good luck.
So there have been a couple of kind of studies on this. So the estimates, these are estimates. The combined prevalence of all of the Ehlers-Danlos syndromes, all 13 variants,
Okay.
including HEDS, appear to be at least 1 in 5,000 individuals worldwide. Now, most of the 13 types of EDS are considered rare. So a study in the UK done in 2016-17 was looking at UK patients with a diagnosis of either EDS or JHS, so Ehlers-Danlos syndromes or joint hypermobility syndromes. So it's kind of a vague, like it could include multiple things, right?
It seemed like a wide net.
Yeah. And so that study for about a year's worth of patients was 194.2 per 100,000 patients, which is about 2% of the population.
What percent do you need to be considered rare? Do you know that off the top of your head?
I don't. NORD. I can look that up. The NORD.
Yeah, we'll put that in on the video.
From NORD.org, about 1 in 10 Americans has a rare disease. That's about 30 million people. More than half are children. And patients with rare diseases are frequently misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed. Damn.
Okay. But in terms of EDS being a rare disorder, it still is considered rare because of the diagnosis, right? By the way, it doesn't matter, that prevalence question. The classical type occurs in about 1 in 20,000 to maybe 40,000 people.
Okay.
And vascular EDS, or VEDS, which has the most impact on mortality, is a much more rare type of EDS and is considered to be the most serious. It's estimated that VEDS affects about 1 in 50,000 to 1 in 200,000 people.
Oh, wow.
And so in the US, that's about 1,500 to 6,500 Americans total. But it is important to note that joint hypermobility, being bendy, flexible, alone is somewhat common just in the general population because it can present with absolutely really no complications, particularly in children. There are forms of acquired or trained hypermobility too. Certain athletes are trained to be hypermobile.
Well, that makes sense. So if there are complications that could be related to it and a further workup is indicated, so like that can happen. So ultimately, you need to know if you have this, because otherwise you're going to like hurt yourself or make yourself worse off, which I think I'm experiencing some of that now. So let's talk about how do we get a diagnosis? What's the path?
So let's start talking about that. I think in this episode, we're going to talk about just kind of a big general overview. And the path to diagnosis is going to be more than one podcast episode. The first thing I want to start talking about is just to warn you to set the expectation that it takes a little bit of time to get to a diagnosis. As a vocal advocate for zebras, the most common question I always get asked is, what type of doctor do I see for a diagnosis? But right now, the most important thing I want you to get out of this episode is that getting diagnosed is all about getting the support that you need and being proactive. But you can start supporting yourself today.
Yep.
You don't have to wait for support while you wait for an evaluation if you're waiting to see a specialist, for example. Unfortunately, the time to diagnose this disorder, even though we're born with it, is much too slow. In fact, the Hypermobility Syndromes Association states that about 55% of its members, so more than half of us, wait more than 10 years to receive a diagnosis.
That's
so
right.
Once we start seeking care for like these things, it can take a decade for about half of us.
Yeah. And zebras, most of us were not diagnosed until middle age. It's a lot of statistics shared. That was a lot of numbers. But generally, so the delay in diagnosis and the age is, that sucks. So it doesn't matter what stats we reference. Like there's
it's disappointing.
Yeah.
So the route to diagnosis can depend on many factors, including your doctor's knowledge of the heritable connective tissue disorders and your unique presentations. Many hypermobile humans have been on a very long and convoluted journey. Some of us don't have the same privilege or types of access to healthcare. Regardless, though, most zebras have come to many a dead end. And when hypermobility is finally kind of questioned as maybe a cause of all your health issues, it's often with the help of a very special doctor named Dr. Google, because we just start seeking answers on our own because we know something is going on. It's bigger than just this one thing, because there's 10 one things. Yeah. So sadly, this is the biggest reason why we started this podcast, because so many people are starting to put together the pieces outside of their healthcare because there's a struggle. There's just pretty poor awareness of the condition among medical professionals. So that means it can go undiagnosed or unrecognized, even if you're seeking care for something. It can commonly be misdiagnosed, wrongly diagnosed as another physical condition. It's not uncommon that you be dismissed or just referred to another specialist or referred to just psychological management.
Yeah.
It's not uncommon for us to have attended many medical appointments, rounds and rounds of physical therapy before the possibility of hypermobility is even mentioned and considered by somebody treating us. And many of us are having to advocate for ourselves and say, hey, I think this is a problem, and struggling to find help in the medical field to, get diagnosed, get supported. And it's not just for ourselves. A lot of us that have families are struggling to have our children be evaluated as well. So from conversations with others, just anecdotally amongst the community, a lot of us have experienced medical gaslighting, being dismissed. And what's kind of frustrating is the signs and symptoms in an individual with HADS and HSD can vary very profoundly, not only between individuals, but between families and even between our own selves within our lifetimes. Our symptoms change sometimes day to day.
Yeah. And so those misdiagnoses of like fibromyalgia and myalgic encephalomyelitis, did I say that right?
Yeah.
I think. We're just going to call that ME because we like letters here. ME/CFS. So like, that's new to me. Like that's the first time I've heard that regarding me, but I've been told I had like IBS and I have digestive problems, which are common with this. And then I've also been told, oh, well, you're just depressed and anxious. You've had or exercise more. And it's like, how do you do that? And so like people like me typically wait years, decades if you get it, and that's if you get one at all. So that's why we're doing this. We have diagnoses now, but we know there are so many more of you out there. So how do you get diagnosed? Like what do they actually do?
So the diagnostic pathway differs according to the type of EDS suspected. So it's a different route for HEDS and HSD versus the more rare types. Diagnosis largely though is based on identifying a group of like symptoms and signs, phenotypes or physical presentation.
And what is phenotype? Okay, so I remember that from biology. Phenotype is how your genes make you look, right? And then genotype is what your genes actually say.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay, so
and the phenotypes vary even among genotypes.
Fantastic. There's your biology 101. All right.
Yep. So in general, though, here are the steps to getting diagnosed. Number 1, document and organize your symptoms and your personal health history. Number 2, find a provider that's aware of the connective tissue disorders. 3, get screened for hypermobility in a clinical evaluation. Then 3 and 4 or the next 4 and 5 sometimes happen together, where you go in and you have a clinical evaluation with somebody more familiar with hypermobility and EDS and connective tissue disorders. So oftentimes initially there'll be a clinical evaluation that's just assessing hypermobility and scoring that. And then they may go ahead and go into this next part of the clinical evaluation. And they may do it at the same appointment. And they will do a clinical evaluation of the criteria for hypermobile EDS, which includes that scoring portion of hypermobility, as well as an evaluation of any additional features and history.
Scoring, are you talking about that? We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
I never say it right.
And then they also look for other signs and symptoms of other types of diagnoses that cause hypermobility to exclude them. And then finally, if warranted, if there's certain warning signs for the known genetic variants of the inherited connective tissue disorders, then that may warrant genetic testing and consultation with a geneticist.
Okay. So that's a lot of steps before you even get to that bite and test thing that people talk about all the time.
That's why
because everybody wants to jump to that, right?
And the most important thing that I said I wanted you to hear was go ahead and start getting the support that you need, right? But the first step really in terms of with medical professionals, once you've got all your ducks in a row, is to determine the severity of your hypermobility. And then based on your clinical presentation, all your other signs and symptoms and history, then your doctor will decide how to proceed.
Okay.
So if your doctor can rule out other conditions just in a physical examination and talking to you about your family and your own history, it is possible and likely that you could be diagnosed with hypermobile EDS or HSD solely based on your clinical physical presentation and your history. But if your body and history shows some concerning warning signs of other disorders, then you may need to be genetically diagnosed.
Okay.
And
so
then they
in
will
our
refer
cases,
you.
In our cases, our family history and our personal, with me, it was more family history, and with you is more your symptom, warranted.
Oh, and mine was both family and my own history.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, so
you
we
had it.
both, yeah, so we ended up both seeing geneticists. But what I wanted to tell you is don't get mad if they say you don't necessarily need to see a geneticist.
Yeah.
But you can always, if you don't agree and you see some warning signs in your history, you can always say, well, what about this? And ask for consideration. Sometimes a physician won't see a need for further evaluation. It is possible that even your primary care doctor, if they're educated on hypermobility, could diagnose you with HEDS, HSD,
Right.
without seeing the necessity in consulting with a geneticist, a rheumatologist, or other specialists. But many of us still are going to be referred to another type of specialist just to help support you or manage other conditions and symptoms and histories that you may have. Just because like you may just be diagnosed in primary care doesn't mean you don't need to see other specialists, because with all these other comorbidities, other common conditions that we deal with, you probably need some help from other types of specialists. So let's kind of discuss in detail getting your ducks in a row.